how to develop a solo. And really, what I notice, even with my own playing at times, over all the years, I've been developing vocabulary, tunes to learn. And if you don't structure your practice session, okay, on how to develop your soloing, it can get really random when you actually start to just, if you're performing, let's say, or if you're just trying to have fun and play, it can just, what I mean by random is there's not a structured way of how your solos are arcing, I'll call it, or you're just, speaking in random notes and it doesn't have motion with it. So I thought this would be a good way to understand how to practice that. And when I keep saying practice is, once you practice something multiple times, obviously, hours at an end, when you start to perform, these aren't things that you are going to go, okay, today I'm going to try this in my performance. You walk away from the practice session and you just play. But these are the things that you have to do. So the very first thing that we're going to talk about is utilizing space and rhythm. So I don't care if you have, some of the best vocabulary out there. If you are not utilizing space with that vocabulary or rhythm, and if you're out of rhythm, it just doesn't sound good. It won't sound good. And so that is the huge key moment for you to practice is how to have space in your playing and how to make sure that your rhythms are in the pocket, I'll call it. No matter what kind of style you're playing, whether it's bossa nova or swing, Latin, it has to stay in the pocket. It has to be in time. So you can practice that. So one of the things that I suggest, and no matter what, no matter how advanced you are, I think I always come back to this type of practicing and it kind of settles me in. I think when you use space in your solo right off the bat, it will help you settle in. What I mean by that is it can help your, if you're kind of frantic, let's say in your soloing because you don't know what to do or you're trying too much. When you use space, it allows you to calm down a little bit. Also, no one wants to hear you come right out of the gates unless it's just some burning tune that you really feel like that's just necessary. But even then, space is great. Another thing about space is that it can allow you to play a lot more courses throughout. If you're running out of ideas, well, it's because you're probably playing too much. And space can just allow that to, be a longer solo. Usually for me, when I use more space, I'm also able to develop ideas more because I have more time to think about it. Okay, so a sample that I'm going to show you is how to use space, but also rhythm. Now, sometimes what I'll do with this is that I will actually write down maybe 3 or 4 different types of rhythms before I do anything. It can be triplets, dotted quarter note, eighth note kind of feel, anything. And I'll write it down. Or if I don't write it down, I'll scat it before I do anything. So if I'm going to play over a blues, which I'm going to show you in a second, I'll scat a rhythm. Boo, bop, boo, boo, doo, doo, bop, something as simple as that. And my idea and my goal is to incorporate that rhythm over the tune I'm going to work on. Also, I will develop 1 or 2, maybe 3 notes with that rhythm. I'm not worried about how many notes I can play with this rhythm. It's trying to just simplify space, rhythm, less notes. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play a sample. It's over a blues, B-flat blues, and like I mentioned, I put the PDF of the B-flat blues changes, and you can follow along with that. I'm going to share the sample, and what you're going to hear me do is play with, like I mentioned, 1 or 2 notes. And by the way, does it really have to be within the chord changes when you're working on this? I mean, this is an exercise for what? Space and rhythm. So if I'm not necessarily playing the right notes as of yet, if I'm kind of making this as a beginning moment for anybody out there, that's okay. I'd rather hear somebody swing really hard with great rhythm and space, okay? So, all right, I'm gonna stop this share here, and I'm gonna go into another page here. And like I said, as I share this, if you don't hear it, I'll look at my comments and find out. All right, so on this page, it's an iTunes page. And we're going to start off with space, with using 1 or 2 notes. I might have at some point used 3 more notes or so, but let's check it out and see if you can hear it, okay? I'm going to rewind it. Here we go. Okay, so I wish I would have wrote down every rhythm that I played, but I did not do that. And for me, that was all about allowing space and trying to figure out a rhythm that I could maybe utilize again, right? If you notice, at times I played it multiple times throughout, or I would come back to it, okay? And to me, I mean, that's swinging sound and it's working and it's helping me develop rhythms that I might not be able to do with a lot of notes. So that's another key moment here. And that's why I said, if you really want to get into some intricate rhythmic ideas, write it out and then try it with 1 note, okay? Now, you might be asking like, well, okay, this is over a blues, and we all know at some point that this is a thing that we can just utilize the blues notes over a blues. So it's an easier way to develop 1 note ideas. But what if we were playing a standard, that had multiple changes? And so I made a sample for you with this same idea, using space and using 1, 2, maybe 3 notes. So I'm going to show that to you on the tune called There Will Never Be Another You. Before we do that, though, I just want to mention another reason why space is so good is it helps you develop how a phrase can begin and end. So another thing I notice with students is that we talk too much, right? In some sense, we say too many things, and when we do that, the important part that of the phrase does not come out anymore. It just becomes like a blend of a bunch of ideas, and sometimes it's hard to kind of gather from that, from audience standpoint and or your own playing or with the group you're playing with. Another reason space is so important, especially when you're playing with maybe a small group setting, let's say. We got to remember this is a communicated type of music. And if you're only communicating with yourself, then it's going to sound that way. And then the rhythm section, let's say, will never be able to kind of play around with what you're doing. So I always say with my students, like, you should leave enough space for a drummer and or somebody that's piano player, let's say, and that's such an important part of jazz in general. I'm just allowing someone else that just wanted to come in, so welcome. Just played a sample just so you know what I was doing of playing with space and just 1, 2, 3 note moments. But back to what I was saying is that using that space can allow more interaction with, somebody that's comping behind me, whether that's a piano player, guitar, or even for drums. And when you allow that, it will help you develop even more ideas because you will then hear more rhythm. If I went bop, boo, ba, doo, bop, and in that space, someone else plays a rhythm, I might catch up on that. So again, another great tool. I'll play that one more time just in the very beginning because I want you to hear it naturally came out for me because I heard, even on this play along, a rhythm and it just came out. This was not planned. I could hear it right when it started. So just check out the very beginning one more time of this sample. So right off the bat, I think the organist went boot up and I went butt up, and that carried me through. And what I'll end up doing is playing, like I mentioned, repeating an idea and then building from that. So that's what you were hearing. Okay, like I mentioned, that's a blues, and that can be a little easier to start off with if you are maybe intimidated by the changes. And I think, I don't want to say blues are easy by any means because I think I still will work on the blues all the time. There's so much in there. But now I'm going to show you the sample of using There Will Never Be Another You, and you're going to notice, obviously, there's a lot of changes. So again, if you're not looking at the PDF, it is in the group chat, or on my Patreon page. You can download it. But here is the sample, again, using space and just maybe 2 to 3 more notes. again, it to me, look, I don't know how many courses that was, maybe three, four, the most. But if your vocabulary is getting more advanced, and you're going to notice by utilizing just this practice moment that you can take off from there if you want. You can start to develop even longer phrases, and your courses are going to extend. You're going to be able to, what we call it is stretching, and that's what we want. We want to be able to develop a solo. And I mentioned the word arc in the very, very beginning. An arc to me is an important part of, soloing in some ways. I'm not always just focused on like, hey, these are the chord changes. I got to play the right harmonic ideas. I want to develop motion and, from maybe low to high and back down. And to me, that's a great tool. By utilizing just space and rhythm, you can do that. I also mentioned, how important space can be. It helps you define a phrase. Think about it this way. I always say this in, like a class or something. If I'm talking just in general, and I allow a lot of space in between my notes, look how powerful that is. And so there's no reason you shouldn't be doing that when you are, I call it speaking through your horn. You got to allow that. And it can help when I say beginning and ending phrases. Now you have this, more of a contour line that you end, and then you have space to begin the next phrase. And it starts to develop better that way with your solos. All right. If you're asking like, hey, what that last tune I just played, there's a lot of chord changes on there. And I mentioned on the blues, you could play any note you want in some sense. I mean, in this case, you noticed I was trying to develop the rhythm and space between all the chord changes and hopefully playing the right chord tones. So that's the next thing that you could add to your challenge, is that making sure that you understand the chord tones of the tune you're playing. So in this case, making sure you understand the 1, the 3, and the 5, and the 7, and beyond if you want. But that could be a great start if you're developing how to go through the changes. It's not vocabulary. Let me just say that real quick. It's just a practice tool so that you can do rhythm and space, and you can utilize the chord tones to do that. And the most important chord tones I was going to mention, I think I put it on the topic there, is your thirds and sevenths. So now we're breaking it down. We don't need the 1 anymore. We don't need the 5. We just really truly need to announce the third and the sevenths. Why? Because that is what makes the chord. That's what defines if it's minor or dominant or major. So why not develop your space in your rhythms with those types of notes? And I think I did for the most part with that. And if I added more, by all means, great, or tried for different notes. Okay, so if, by the way, throughout this lesson, I didn't even know if I put settings where you can't unmute or can't do on video or anything. If you do have questions, okay, type them in that chat, and I will at the end look at them just so I kind of move forward with everything. All right. Next thing is utilizing motifs, where you are trying to develop a phrase, an idea. It can be short, it can be long, it can be a measure long, it can be 2 measures if you really want. But I would suggest doing it in smaller, segments or cells, I'll call them, where that they could even be 4-note motion ideas if you really want. But the idea is to take that phrase or cell and then develop it through the tune. And so then this gets a little bit more on the challenge, of making sure you do know the changes. Now, you go back to the blues, we're not having as much changes, but there are some, and I want to make sure that I can develop a phrase over that. So I'm going to show you a sample of that. And now, what's the difference? I'm not necessarily focused so much on space can be limited on this type of practice because maybe you want to do it on every measure. And so obviously you're not allowing space. Again, this is not a tool for you to go out on performance and go, all right, motif throughout all night. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to figure out how to practice these ideas, and eventually they all mold together. But also, I might be developing a phrase that has rhythm too, okay? So I'm going to show this sample. This is over the blues, and I took an idea and I developed it over maybe one course at times, and then I'm changing to another idea and going throughout the courses like that. So hopefully I gave a good example on this. Here we go. All right. So I should mention too that, again, this was not, I didn't write it out. Could you? Absolutely. You could take an idea that you really want to make sure that you are being very specific with and try to develop that throughout the chord changes. In this case, I was transposing basically on the spot, which I highly recommend trying to do. It's not easy, but I wasn't perfect by any means, but what I was trying to do was take a phrase, an idea, a cell, and I was trying to develop that same idea throughout the chord changes. And you could hear, maybe I changed it by one note, just to make sure I could hear the different, chord change, maybe going to the 4 chord in the blues, or, that kind of concept. And that's, to me, this is a really good way also to learn a tune. You'll real quick find out on maybe a harder tune wow, I'm not able to develop that as quick because you are trying to transpose. And so then that makes you go back and learn the tune better, that kind of thing. And people ask me this a lot, like, how do you learn tunes and how do you memorize them and how do you keep them memorized? Well, this is a great tool right here. And same thing for what we were just doing before with the space and one or two notes. I mean, right now, as I was doing these samples, I was practicing knowing where I was in the changes. If I did that every day, I don't think, I know by the end of the week, I would know that tune. All right, so again, it gets harder as you do a harder tune with more changes. So I'm going to show you the sample with using a motif over the tune, There Will Never Be Another You, and see how I did. No, I ended early. Ha. Okay, so probably made a mistake and said, no, I don't want you to hear that. Okay, again, I'm not looking for perfection on hitting every single note that might play perfectly within the chord changes. It's a phrase that I started with, and I said, I'm going to try to develop it all the way through. And you get better at doing that. You can, like I mentioned, be very specific. And I was going to say one thing I don't want to forget. Could you write this whole thing out as like an etude and start to practice it that way? Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. Everything that you will do, even if you write it out, would help. But on the spot, doing it without writing it out can develop your ears. It can develop, in time, right away happening. And nothing that I'm doing, even though it might be like not sounding as complicated, which we can discuss in a second. These are great practice tools for no matter how advanced you are. I will do this for a student and I'll go back in my own practice session and do the same thing because I'm like, wow, this, I got to get back to that. And that is really important. What I was about to say about the complications of like soloing and learning stuff, don't make it complicated, when you're practicing. Make it, if it is becoming complicated, then step back a second and remember the space and two notes can help develop and settle you in again. Okay, so now we've worked on the space and the rhythm. Notice during the motif you're still working on rhythm because your ideas doesn't, it's not always just eighth notes or it can be different in a variation of things. So now the next step is taking an idea that is very specific from listening to someone else play it, knowing, maybe a transcription of, and knowing that it fits over a very spot that at least from what you heard it was on, like an example, like it's a D minor and you know it fits over that, or if it's a G7 and you know it fits over that, a phrase that you know. And how do you get to that point? You transcribe a solo, and you take and make sure that you're doing this by ear for the most part, and then you write it out afterwards, and then analyze where, make sure you know the tune you're transcribing, like There Will Never Be Another You, let's say, and you listen to Chet Baker playing a solo over it and go, wow, what is he doing over the, third and fourth measure? And you transcribe that idea and you like it enough, and that's what you want to run with, then you take that idea, you understand why it works, what scale maybe it's coming from, and then you transpose that in all 12 keys. I don't just do 1 or 2 or 3. I always do all 12. After that, this is where I'm going to show you in a second, is you want to try to apply it in the very specific spots that you know it works in. And you take a backing track, or play with on your own, or you play with other people and go, all right, I'm going to throw it in every time I get to that measure, and practice playing it in time on those 2-3 measures that you have developed. Now, this is practice. Again, this is not how you would go in performance time and go, all right, here's measure 3 and 4, and you start to play that. It would never work that way. But this is how you develop your vocabulary. And to get more vocabulary, once you start to play it in time in the same spots that you know it works, you can challenge yourself by changing the rhythm of it. And that naturally does happen as you are able to do this. So what I'm going to show you is this. I took a line from Blue Mitchell, and I transcribed, I'm going to forget the name. Oh, I'll Close My Eyes. And he played this little phrase that was like a 2-5 phrase. And I worked on it in all 12 keys. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to develop that idea over the blues. I know it fits over a minor. I know it fits over a 5 chord. So I'm going to show you the sample, and I'm going to try to play it in the spots that I know it works only. And then you're going to hear me try to develop, I think I did this as a sample, as like I'll utilize that same idea, but also within the other chord changes that I'm not playing it, I will develop my other ideas. And it can kind of start to combine into a solo. Okay. So this is Over the Blues. Before I play the rest of this, notice I didn't do anything else, right? I'm just playing that line. I know it fits in these 3 keys that I'm applying it over. And by the way, I will have that on my Patreon page. I'll send it to you guys as a PDF. But I'm not, all I'm focused on with that type of practice is that, can I play it in time? Can I play it exactly where I want to play it? That is not easy to do. And here are the reasons why that will not become easy. A, you don't transpose. If you only know it in a couple keys, you won't remember this lick. If you start to transpose an idea in all 12 keys, your dexterity of that idea will just go through the roof. The memorization of that idea will go through the roof. And then it won't be a problem. If you start to practice it and it's just not under your fingers, you'll see what I mean. It just won't come out, and you'll miss a note or two, and then you got to go back to the practice room. So that's the idea, is just make sure that it's really under your fingers before you start to develop the application of it. And then once you start to do this, it's not even that easy still. It just takes time to develop it. Once you can do it over and over in the same spot, Okay. I want to say you get bored with it, but it's robotic, and that's what we want. We want to be able to say a vocabulary like that, right? And when we're done and practicing all these little topics, we go and perform it. We go play with a backing track, or we just play with friends, or whatever the case is. And you don't think about this stuff. You just play. You just allow it to happen. And that's where the organic side of improvisation can develop from that. So I'm going to continue playing the sample, because I think what I did with this is I played the same idea, but then I started to develop ideas outside of it. All right. So by taking that very specific vocabulary that I transcribed and transposed, and I'm applying it into this idea over the chord changes, and then I start to see, like, hey, I could tell what I was doing was working out another idea between the time, and it could be a rhythm or space or a motif idea that I kind of continue on. And now, I mean, I'm not saying that that's a great solo or anything, but I'm just saying that that is developing ideas now. I'm kind of putting things together now. Okay, now, again, that's the blues, and it has a little bit less worry of changes. So now I'm going to do that same sample over the There Will Never Be Another You, and see how I did. So that specific line that you hear, ba bo do bo do bo do be dee ba do be doo doo, that I'm applying over as many changes as I can in this next tune. And you're going to notice I do wait. There's times where it might not fit in a specific change, so I don't play it there. I'm only doing it in the areas that I know work. All right, here we go. All right. So again, same scenario. I started to, after I knew I had this idea that was in very specific spots of the chord changes, and I was throwing it in time, I felt more comfortable to start to add outside of those areas a motif, rhythm, some space, and develop some ideas within that. If you can only imagine then, let's say, that you kind of work through that whole process, that you do another one, another specific phrase that you get from transcribing, and you work it into another chord change. Again, it's like a puzzle. It's not complicated in that sense. It's work, right? It's a lot of practice. But once you start to do that and you see the puzzles doing this, your lines become longer, or you have more to say in your vocabulary. But don't forget, when you go back to what we did in the very beginning with the space and rhythm, I mean, it all can develop and start to, you really are developing your solo then that way. And that's a great way to practice. I'm going to leave with this last moment of another idea that kind of came up at the very end. And I think I added it to the PDF. So after all this process, right? Another thing that this can be a very difficult type of exercise I'm about to show you, but it's really, I think, essential to seeing multiple things in your playing, is where you don't use a backing track. You don't use a play along, or you're not having anybody play with you. Your only person to develop the chord changes is you. And so you can start with a blues, which is a great starting point, I feel like. And it still can be difficult, because another thing that you're going to try to practice with this is playing in time. And the only way you're going to be able to figure that out is by recording yourself. Push record on your phone or whatever it is, and then develop your solo on, we'll start with the 12-bar blues, and utilize what I've all talked about, maybe 1-2 notes from the chord changes. Very specific ones, thirds and sevenths. Rhythmically, just challenge yourself with it. Maybe a motif, maybe a very specific idea. But try to practice all of that without any backing track or anything, and see how you're developing, hearing the changes, and also hearing time, right? If your time is off, that's more important. I don't care about the notes. It's about the time on this specific exercise. So I'm going to try something here. I'm going to stop the share screen here. And I'm going to go into, real quick, I'm going to press original sound for musicians on. Okay. You're in mute, so hopefully it works. If you press on that, you might hear an echo. So that should be off, I think. Okay. I am going to develop over a blues. I'll do an F blues just to change the key here. Horn is nice and cold. Great. But again, if volume changes on this scenario, then I'm calling it on Zoom, because sometimes it just does that. But here's developing just in time, playing over an F blues, and I'm trying to focus on maybe 1 or 2 notes at first, but developing the changes as well, so I can hear the 12 bars going by. All right, here we go. 1, 2. Hopefully that came across. I apologize, that's Zoom's fault if you can't hear it. But the idea, again, I was just trying really hard to keep time. That's my most important idea with that. And then as I feel that I'm keeping the time, I'm also focused on hearing the changes. So I'm hitting specific chord tones to get myself through the changes. And if I'm feeling comfortable with that, then I'm starting to develop the vocabulary that I have, maybe very specific spots, keeping time. So that took me a long time to try to get to that point. But once I started to really develop that part of that topic, my soloing became better, because imagine then going with a rhythm section and playing, and you can do it already by yourself. Not saying it's easy, but then it just becomes easier and you're more free to play. Now that was over a blues. Now of course then you go into to challenge yourself, standards or changes that have a lot more movement in that, and that takes some time to make sure that you don't do this until you really know the tune. Okay, so that's one important part of this. I wouldn't just go for it, right? Because then you might not develop it and then you get frustrated. Make sure that you really know the chord changes. You could play the 1, 3, 5, 7s of everything and develop that way. So let's see if I can do it a little bit on There Will Never Be Another You. Another thing too is don't be afraid to play the melody, through, and partially add that to your solo if you want. Okay, again, I even, like, during that moment, I kind of ran into like a little, keep my time. So I pulled back on some ideas and just kind of started to just develop like more chord tones, settle in, like I mentioned before. Now, I didn't use a lot of space with that one, I'll say. But, okay, hopefully, I can't believe that was an hour already, but